Man, if cancel culture is so subjective, like who is to literally say, Logan, you're canceled, and then what do I listen? Are they right?
Many influencers host podcasts in order to maintain relevancy, but Impaulsive stands out as it has achieved growth of immense proportions and has had A-list celebrities as its guests. But what goes on behind the curtains is a much darker tale full of toxicity, bullying and manipulation, which has made dedicated co-hosts leave, pointing to only one man as the culprit, Logan Paul. In this video, we're going to focus on the toxic environment of the Impaulsive podcast and what made beloved co-hosts leave the project completely. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of things, we should first look at the history of Logan Paul's popular podcast. After the massive Aokigahara forest controversy, Logan Paul came back from a year-long hiatus in order to maintain his relevancy and started the Impaulsive podcast on October 23, 2018 with co-hosts Mike Malek and Spencer Taylor. The first episode of the podcast premiered on November the 20th of the same year.
Hey, yo, what is up? My name is Logan Paul, controversial YouTube star, boxer, ex-vegan, and now, I guess, podcaster?
What? And the reception towards the podcast was surprisingly positive, with people appreciating Logan's more mature side and interviewing abilities. At first, the podcast was just three friends having a conversation about conspiracies, sex talk, and other wacky topics. But over the years, the podcast blew up, gaining 4.39 million subscribers with over 350 plus episodes, accumulating a total of 600 million channel views. So saying this podcast is big is an understatement. Throughout the years, Impaulsive had guest celebrities like Shaq O'Neal, Mike Tyson, Snoop Dogg, and many more. This alone showed the massive following the podcast had and how eager people were to be a guest on it. At face value, the podcast was seen as funny, motivating, and charming, with Logan and his co-hosts uplifting each other and making the content that viewers deserved. But the story behind the scenes was different, as many fans of the podcast began noticing a pattern where Logan would often dominate his co-hosts and take the spotlight from others, while allowing an environment that was fueled by bullying.
You're a fascinating character, Mike.
Oh, I'm not even mad. I just like, it's a timing thing. It's like, I just don't want to, if it's going to be like every time I say something, I'm just cut me off. Like I could be doing more meaningful shit from the love sack, dude.
Spencer Taylor was one of the first co-hosts alongside Mike Malek. In the beginning, the podcast was usually led by Logan Paul, who interviewed the guest on board. Meanwhile, Mike and Spencer follow up with more questions or usually give witty reactions in response. Mike was always the loud equals funny type of guy, while Spencer was a more quiet and logical individual. Upon realizing this, Logan placed Mike beside him on the table, while Spencer was on the other side, either being all by himself or with the guest. This made Spencer less of a focal point during conversations, as he would usually sit quiet waiting for his moment to ask questions, while Mike and Logan interviewed the guest. With time, fans started to appreciate Mike more than Spencer, as he would frequently be interacting with the guest in a comedic manner. Meanwhile, Spencer was usually known for being the observer in the group, though Spencer did not shy away from this fact and would integrate his questions mid-conversation in a smart manner, making fans appreciate his patience and interviewing skills. This dynamic of the trio kept on going for years, but after some time, Spencer realized that he wasn't being properly utilized on the show and wasn't passionate anymore. As Logan was excelling in his career with boxing matches and business ventures, Spencer felt like his dreams weren't being achieved. So he took a break during episodes until Impaulsive episode 150, where Spencer announced he will be leaving the podcast and wants to focus on himself.
Like, dude, this place is like, it's just not motivating me anymore. Like, I feel like spiritually I need something new.
Many fans of the podcast were emotional upon hearing this news, but some members pointed out how Logan and Mike dominated Spencer in previous episodes, saying, "Poor Spencer, I noticed in the last episode he started to mention meditating and got interrupted. And then when they tried to let him finish, he said, 'No, for this audience you go ahead,' meaning that he thinks the average Impaulsive viewer isn't interested in meditating or what he has to say about it. Sucks to feel like you don't have your people." Spencer Taylor was always the spiritual guy among the trio, and fans loved him for it. But his deep, meaningful conversations were always interrupted by Logan or Mike suddenly changing the topic as they felt Spencer's monologues aren't interesting for the viewers. So him leaving was bound to happen.
I wish he got a chance to meet Spencer. So we actually had a snowflake on the show. Well, or at least
he's sitting right here.
Literally,
Oh,
you could have. He's not really a snowflake, but people thought he was a little. But anyways, he moved to Hawaii to
for
just
spiritual reasons.
Yes. How did you know?
After his announcement on January 17th, 2020, Spencer posted a video on Twitter mentioning that he fell into a depression and wanted to focus on his career of making documentaries instead, while respectfully wishing the Impaulsive crew the best of luck. Among the trio, Logan and Mike have the strongest relationship together, as both would be side by side supporting each other literally and figuratively. But people outside the Impaulsive community have pointed out that Mike has never spoken against Logan and has become his yes man in every situation. Mike Malek was a nobody before his Impaulsive deal with Logan, so it was only a matter of time until fame got into his head and would treat Logan as his idol. Though both have had their disputes with each other in the past, but it was always Mike who came running back to Logan. After Spencer's departure from the podcast, Logan and Mike were now in full control of the interviews they had with guests. The podcast resumed as usual and even got better with time, making fans forget about the trio aspect until a new co-host was introduced known as Mac, who turned out to be Logan's childhood friend. Fans began loving Mac as he would balance Logan and Mike's chaotic energy with calm and in-depth meaningful takes on topics. Mac always had a passion for making art, even mentioning it numerous times in the podcast, describing his love for it. While Logan had no problem with Mac's art stories, Mike on the other hand tried his best to interrupt Mac as many times as possible because according to Mike, the viewers do not care for Mac's love for art. But Mike's dissing of Mac's passion had a deeper meaning, as during episodes fans would point out the fact that Mike felt jealous whenever Logan and Mac described their friendship. Some saying the look of hate and jealousy on Mike's face in that moment is like finding out your ex is screwing your homie. In return, Mike would always find ways to start new conversations with Logan and tried to keep interaction with Mac as little as possible. The cracks between the trio had already started to show, as many episodes would feel awkward and full of passive aggressiveness. But what came after was the final straw for Mac, as he now deleted episode 213. Mike and Logan began insulting Mac's passion and how his love for art isn't important for the podcast.
What Mike's saying is that sometimes we get to a point where we try to maybe talk about stuff that we think would appeal to more people.
Absolutely.
And your stuff is a little bit more niche.
The disrespect towards Mac infuriated fans, and many appreciated his tolerance during the argument with Mike. A fan saying, "I'd rather watch Mac talk about paint drying than Mike literally talk about anything." After the episode aired, many fans started clowning on Mike and how immature he was during the whole episode. Later on, Mike tweeted an apology about the incident, but never directly apologized to Mac himself, stating, "I recognize my faults and will work not only to right them but to be better in the future." All seemed normal until episode 219 of the podcast, where Logan announced that Mac had left the podcast completely and was being replaced by a new co-host.
Here's the good news. We have found a third co-host already. Ladies and gentlemen, you've waited for this moment, and I have too. He's an excellent, excellent human being, one of my best friends, probably even more impulsive than both Mike and I combined.
George Janko. Upon the departure of both Spencer and Mac, a pattern was becoming known that Logan and Mike were dominating any third co-host they would hire. So why did they hire George Janko? Is it because they were used to having a third perspective in the conversation? Or did they want someone to be the butt of their jokes every time there was nothing to talk about? George Janko is a fellow influencer that has been a guest on Impaulsive in the past, but due to the overwhelming feedback from fans, Logan decided to recruit George into his team and make him an official co-host. After his first appearance in episode 219, George was highly praised by the Impaulsive community, fans mentioning that George just brings the podcast to the next level. Love Mac, but George is just made for podcasts. This trio about to blow up the podcast space. The future looked bright for the podcast as George's energy and charisma made the podcast more intriguing and upbeat. So much so, Mike was sidelined during some conversations, and many fans appreciated George's interviewing style. But after a while, George became distant and seemed to be zoned out during guest episodes, even being called out by Shaq and Bobby Lee for being so boring and lacking interesting topics to talk about. But that's not all, as Logan would also join in with the guest to roast George, making him feel even worse, causing him to walk out during episodes. George usually talked about spirituality and how to be a better person.
I was very depressed. I was very alone. I was about to pack my bags and go straight to Arizona. Right there, I made a flesh decision because life was too hard right now. I didn't know what I could do. And then I immediately said, I got to give this a higher power.
But that was not good enough for Logan, as he was usually insulted in front of guests for being moody and a vibe killer. To make things worse, Logan often criticized George for being religious and believing in a higher power. In a deleted episode, Logan told George, "You need a therapist because Jesus isn't doing that for you," which offended George and infuriated fans, many calling Logan out for being ignorant and disrespectful towards people with different beliefs. Later, George stated that he was going through the worst 2 years of his life, and no one ever checked in on him except for Malek, even after telling the crew that Logan continued to interrupt and belittle George for not being practical enough. After the deleted episode, George started appearing less in future episodes and would soon go on to make his own podcast. Even though George is still the third co-host of Impaulsive, but how much more repeated belittlement will he face till he announces his departure and becomes another victim of Logan's toxic podcast environment? Thanks for watching our video about the sad reality of Impaulsive co-hosts. If you want more videos like this one, click on our previous entry about the king of toxic masculinity, Andrew Tate. For more engaging content, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. Also, stay tuned by hitting that bell icon as we'll discuss why Steiny from the Nelk Boys is the odd man out every time in our next entry. Till then, we'll see you in our next video.